Hello and welcome to Crosstalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. In the crosshairs, as Israel appears to be preparing for still another assault on the Gaza Strip, on this edition of Crosstalk, we ask how it got to this point and what Israel hopes to achieve. To Crosstalk, the assault on Gaza, I'm joined by my guest, Dan Arbel in Washington. He's a scholar in residence at the Center for Israel Studies at the American University. In New York, we have Norman Finkelstein. He's a political analyst and author. And in Amsterdam, we cross to Rabbani. He is a senior fellow at the Institute for Palestine Studies. All right, gentlemen, Crosstalk rules. And in fact, that means you can jump in anytime you want, and I very much encourage it. Norman, if I can go to you first here, how did we get to this point? Israel says it began when Hamas kidnapped and murdered 3 Israeli teens. What's your take?
I think, if you don't mind, I'd rather if Mouin answers that question because he's closer to the situation there. Okay, due deference. Mouin, go ahead.
Well, the fact of the matter is that so far we still don't know who abducted and killed these 3 Israeli youths. Israel immediately blamed Hamas, and we also now know that the Israeli government suppressed evidence it had very early on that these 3 youths had been killed in order to claim that it was seeking to resolve a hostage situation, and used that as a pretext to launch a military rampage throughout the West Bank from the far north to the far south, while Hamas, which usually almost immediately claims responsibility for its actions, and if anything exaggerates its activities, has this time stated that it has no involvement in this incident. So I think we need to look at what Israel's broader objectives are in terms of using this incident as a pretext.
Okay, Dan, Mouin says it's a pretext. Your reply to that?
Well, first of all, Hamas was behind the kidnapping of those 3 innocent youngsters who were brutally murdered by Hamas operatives. There's clear evidence pointing to the fact that Hamas is behind it. And Hamas is also driving a reckless policy at the moment. Israel is fighting a just war. Hamas initiated this conflict. It started this conflict. No other country in the world will tolerate, would tolerate such an attack on its cities, towns, civilians. And Israel is doing its utmost to protect its citizens.
Okay, Norman, would you like to reply to that? Just war.
Well, first of all, there is no evidence at this point that Hamas was responsible. Even the U.S. State Department, which typically apologizes for any and every Israeli action, the U.S. State Department was asked just 2 days ago on July 9th, do you have evidence that Hamas was behind this? And they said, as of now, we don't have evidence. In any event, what's clear is that Prime Minister Netanyahu then exploited this incident for political purposes. And as I'm sure Dan is aware, it was all over the Israeli press, and it was said candidly, it was said with forthrightly, that Prime Minister Netanyahu was using the incident in order to destroy Hamas, and because he wanted to dismantle the unity government. And this is fairly typical of the Israeli government. It's what the Israeli political scientist Avner Yaniv called the Israeli fear of Palestinian peace offensives. In this case, Hamas formed a unity government with the Palestinian Authority on the terms that were put forth by the U.S. and the EU. Hamas accepted those terms, and now Netanyahu was cornered. He was going to be forced to negotiate. And so he does what Israel historically has always done. It tries to nip these Palestinian peace offensives in the bud, in this case by attacking Hamas and hoping and praying to evoke some sort of reaction.
Dan, would you like to reply to that?
Yes, please. Hamas initiated this conflict. It started with a barrage of rockets and missiles on Israeli towns and villages. It was offered by Israel a calm for calm deal. It rejected that. Not only did it reject the offer, but it went on an aggressive campaign. And again, no other country in the world would sit idly by and just watch a barrage of rockets into its territory and not respond. Would Vladimir Putin sit idly by if Moscow and St. Petersburg would be under the threat of rockets and missiles? I assure you that he wouldn't. And so other leaders in the Western world, such as Cameron, Merkel, Hollande, Obama, they would not sit idly by. And the leader of Israel, the government of Israel, has a commitment to its people to protect them, to ensure safety and stability. And that's what Israel is doing at the moment. Israel cannot do anything but to respond.
I want Norman and Mouin to react to that. Mouin, would you like to react to that? Because all of the leaders in all of the countries that Dan just mentioned,
I mean,
they don't have under captivity, under blockade, under siege, 1.6 million people. Go ahead, Mouin.
Well, no, but I mean, what Dan is presenting us is just a series of slogans and unsupported assertions. This idea that Israel is offering a ceasefire. In fact, Netanyahu is on record today, and you can see it on any news website saying that Israel has no interest in a ceasefire at that point. Well, Hamas has stated very clearly that it is prepared, but that Israel is unprepared to negotiate. So we can either base our positions and analysis and conclusions on reality, or we can just throw around meaningless slogans and unsupported assertions, which isn't going to get us anywhere, really.
Okay, Norman, jump in. You wanted to jump in. Please do.
Well, Dan says that Israel is doing what any other country in the world would do. First of all, as he mentioned among the leaders who would do something, he mentioned Prime Minister David Cameron in the UK. Cameron himself, who is a great friend of Israel, a great supporter of Israel, he himself has described Gaza as a prison camp. And then you have to ask yourself, what rights do people under occupation have to resist the occupation? And here the international law is very clear. The international law says, number one, and I hope Dan will respond specifically to the point I'm making now, international law says, number one, that an occupier has no right under international law to suppress a struggle for self-determination. That is to say, Israel has no right whatsoever. If the Palestinians are resisting the occupation, Israel has no right whatsoever under international law to use force in order to suppress the Palestinian struggle for self-determination. The international law is a little bit more ambiguous on the rights of people under occupation to use force, but most scholars agree that they do have that right. So, as a broad general statement, the Palestinians are exercising their right
Norman,
of
Gaza is not under Israeli occupation. Gaza is not under occupation. Gaza since 2005 has been not under occupation. Israel withdrew from Gaza in 2005 and vowing never to return, and has not returned. It uprooted settlements from Gaza. Israel is not in Gaza. I'm very sorry to clarify that to you if you forgot.
Okay, Norman, hang on, Jen. I want to clarify something here. Mouin, Israel is not in Gaza. Please react to that statement.
Israel removed its military bases and its settlements from within the Gaza Strip. That's true, but I believe it's the position of even the International Committee of the Red Cross that Gaza remains occupied territory for, among other reasons, that Israel still controls the airspace, the territorial waters, most of the boundaries of the Gaza Strip. Israel has been imposing a punishing 7-year blockade of the Gaza Strip. And so it's quite possible, and I presume there are other examples as well, that you can control and occupy a territory without being physically within it. It's a form of indirect rule, if you will. And perhaps even more importantly, Israel almost at will launches these kinds of armed assaults on the Gaza Strip as well, which is, you know, and in that sense, the legitimacy of Israel's actions is also very much open to question, particularly in terms of international law, as Norman just explained.
Okay, Dan, do you want to react to that?
The UN Security Council, yes, I would, because the UN Security Council adopted the Palmer Commission report back in September 2011, which clearly states that the Israeli naval blockade on Gaza is legal. And so Muen and Norman can argue from today till tomorrow that that is not the case, but the naval blockade of Gaza by Israel is legal and has been recognized as such by the United Nations.
Okay, Norman, do you want to react to that?
You're now raising a completely different issue.
I'm not going to get into the I'm not going to get into the factual details now, but for those who are interested in the small facts, what Dan just said is false on 2 counts. Number one, as he did correctly say, the Palmer Commission only dealt with the naval blockade. It did not deal with the land blockade. Number two, the UN Security Council never approved the Palmer Commission report. That report was commissioned by Ban Ki-moon and had nothing to do with the other branches of the United Nations. But let's get to the bigger issue. Dan says 2 things. Dan says, first of all, he says Gaza is not under occupation. Well, I have a question for you, Dan. You mentioned Prime Minister Cameron, not me. You mentioned Prime Minister David Cameron. So when David Cameron referred to Gaza as a prison, who are the prison guards? Who was he referring to when he referred to Gaza as a giant prison camp? Who are the guards of that prison camp? Israel's senior authority in international law, as I'm sure you know, is Yoram Din.
Hamas is keeping its citizens as prisoners.
Sir, Dan, you're on television. Don't make a fool of yourself before the whole world. You know full well who David Cameron was referring to as the prison guards.
On this point, gentlemen, we're going to go to a short break. And after that short break, we'll continue our discussion on Gaza. Stay with RT. Okay, Mouin, I'd like to go back to you in Amsterdam. The Obama administration says, quote, it supports Israel's right to defend itself against these rockets. How do you reply to that?
Well, I think very much along the lines that Norman has already replied, which is that this is not about the right of a sovereign state to defend itself. It's really about whether a state has the right to occupy, colonize, and dispossess another people. I mean, the idea that entire families are being blown to smithereens by the Israeli Air Force in the Gaza Strip. And the best that the Obama administration can come up with is that Israel has an absolute and unconditional right to self-defense, which Washington will defend uncritically. You know, morally obscene is really the first and only term that comes to mind here.
Okay, Dan, Israel says it always is being mindful of civilians when it attacks Gaza. And let's face it, historically it happens quite often, every few years. But the death toll, the civilian death toll, is always quite high. So what kind of precision is that?
You know, it's a great question, Peter, and I think that it's important to remember. In the last 3 days, more than 450 rockets and missiles were launched into Israel, into cities, towns, villages, and thank God for the Iron Dome missile system that was able to intercept them. If not, it would have been inhabited.
Why don't you answer the question?
But Israel, Israel, during this time, has to respond to this barrage of rockets and missiles. And during this entire conflict, first of all, Israel has been continuing humanitarian assistance into the Gaza Strip. Israel, when it attacks surgically, strikes at targets which are clearly connected to Hamas, tries to avoid targeting the civilian population, actually warns civilians by dispersing leaflets, by calling the homes, by initiating announcements to stay away from harm's way. So Israel is doing its utmost to keep this an attack on Hamas and not on the citizens of Gaza.
Okay, but Norman, no matter how you cut it, I mean, if you get a leaflet or not, this is collective punishment. This is collective punishment, and that is illegal under international law. Norman, go ahead.
Let's look at the picture. On the Israeli side, how many people have been killed? 0. There hasn't even been a single reported injury. from these so-called barrages of Gaza rocket attacks on Israel. There has been 0 casualties and apparently so far no reported injuries. As a matter of fact, I haven't even read a report of a building being damaged yet. In fact, I face more danger this past weekend when I went to the Coney Island fireworks than the Israelis have experienced, suffered from the Gaza attacks. Now let's look at the Gaza side. So far, 69 people have been killed. Of those 69, 60 have been civilians. So you have approximately a total ratio of 70 to 0, civilians 60 to 0. Does that sound like a war? Now, he says it's because of the Iron Dome. First of all, we haven't a clue. We don't have a... Right, we don't have
Hamas is cynically using the citizens of Gaza,
how many of these
and is advocating for human shields, for people to become human shields for its operations. And it's launching rockets and missiles from schools and hospitals and from private homes. So there is, when you fight such a warfare, when innocent people are in harm's way, unfortunately, regretfully, they sometimes are hurt. Israel is doing its utmost not to allow this to happen, and has tried to very surgically distract Hamas.
Gentlemen, don't talk over each other. Go ahead, Norman, and then I want to go to Mouin. Okay, go ahead, Norman.
Dan, one second. Dan, you're reading from the wrong script. You're reading from the script from the 2008-9 war. Israel hasn't even claimed that Hamas has been firing from schools and hospitals. That's the old script. Now you're using the human shield script. So let's look at it.
This is very
Israel has freely admitted.
This is fresh evidence.
Yeah, okay, Dan. Fresh evidence, sure. You just pulled it out of your pocket. Let's look at the evidence. Israel has freely admitted that it's targeting. Okay, Israel has freely admitted that it's targeting the homes of Hamas militants, the civilian homes. That's not legal under international law. Even if you give a warning, even if you tap on the roof. How would you like it, Dan, if I tapped on your roof? Or gave you a warning on a cell phone that I'm going to blow up your house?
How would you like it if missiles
Does that give me the right to do it?
All right, gentlemen, I'm going to go to Mouin in Amsterdam. Mouin, it's very interesting this time round. Because Hamas... Go ahead, jump in, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, Dan is, again, just presenting us with a series of meaningless slogans and unsupported assertions, including ones that, as Norman has pointed out, even Israel is not making. And this idea that it's somehow legitimate to blow up someone's house simply because you've indicated you're going to do it. And if the person's wife and children are murdered, well, that means they're human shields. By the same logic, Hamas has announced that it's going to seek to lob missiles at all of Israel. Isn't that considered fair warning, considering that virtually every Israeli family has a member who serves in the Israeli military? I mean, you know, civilian non-combatants are either legitimate or illegitimate targets. But to take a tribal approach to this, which is to say that it's legitimate to murder Palestinian civilians, but it's illegitimate for Israeli civilians to be targeted, well, that has absolutely no moral and no political standing. One either takes a clear position on the protection for civilian non-combatants in conflict, or one doesn't. And if one doesn't, I think Dan should have the decency to admit that he values different human life differently according to his political preferences. Okay, Dan, would you like to reply to that?
Yes, I'd like to say, to remind us all where we are. You know, the two other participants, Norman and Wayne, sound like they came from Mars, not from planet Earth. And what we're facing here is a situation in which Israel is under a barrage of rockets initiated by Hamas, which refused to a ceasefire, which continues to use homes, schools to fire at Israelis, which is cynically trying to raise the casualty number of casualties in the Gaza Strip for its own
for
its own purposes. Last week, last week when Israel offered calm for calm, Hamas not only rejected it, but went on aggressively to launch continued rocket attacks. So this is what I'm talking about. So let's all play along and see what we're talking about, not pretend we're in some other conflict.
That's the issue, that Mouin wants to don't play along, okay? That's the problem, okay? Mouin, you wanted to say something? Go ahead.
Okay.
Go ahead, Mouin.
Yeah, why should I play along with pure fantasy? The fact of the matter is, one only has to consult today's Israeli press, where Netanyahu states explicitly that Israel has no interest in a ceasefire and that a ceasefire is not on the agenda. And Hamas is stating that there is no one to negotiate a ceasefire with. Now, one can either accept that and, in Dan's case, seek to justify it because apparently his political principle is that anything and everything Israel does is right, or, one can start making things up and putting forth these increasingly bald assertions and bringing in Mars and Earth and whatnot. But, facts are facts, and at some point, people have to deal with them.
Okay, Norman, it's slightly changed gears here. This time round, Hamas doesn't have a lot of allies, particularly when we look at Egypt and its other Arab donors. They're alone. They're standing alone right now. And, it looks like Tel Aviv sees this as an opportunity. Hamas is isolated. The entire Middle East is aflame right now. It's an opportunity for Tel Aviv to get rid of their greatest nemesis.
Right, but you have to understand why Hamas is their greatest nemesis. Hamas is their greatest nemesis because they formed a unity government with the Palestinian Authority. Hamas is their greatest nemesis because Hamas agreed to the conditions set forth by the EU and the US for negotiations. Hamas is their greatest enemy because the US and the EU agreed to negotiate with the new unity government. Hamas is their greatest enemy because Hamas was so weak, as you correctly put it. Hamas was so weak that it was now being forced in a position where, together with the Palestinian Authority, it would negotiate a reasonable settlement of the conflict. And that's the thing that Netanyahu, like Israel's leaderships in the past, have always dreaded. That's why they coined the phrase, these Palestinian peace offensives. Israel doesn't know what to do when the Palestinians are ready to negotiate. So it does what it always does.
Peter, Hamas,
it pounds them, it engages
Hamas
in assassination, it engages in mass arrests.
According to EU law.
All right, gentlemen, I want to give the last word to Dan. Dan, 20 seconds. I want to be fair. Go ahead.
Hamas is a terrorist organization branded as such by U.S. law, EU law, and other countries around the world. Hamas is recklessly causing this situation. Hamas has to pay a dear price for what it's doing. Israel cannot stand idly by in the face of this cynical policy conducted by Hamas, and will continue until it brings peace and tranquility to the land of Israel.
Okay, do you think that's going to happen, Norman? 10 seconds.
There'll be peace and tranquility in the land of Israel when Israel negotiates a settlement of the conflict according to international law. Everybody's ready for the conflict to end except the lunatics in Tel Aviv.
Okay, gentlemen, we've run out of time. Many thanks to my guests in Washington, New York, and Amsterdam. And thanks to our viewers for watching us here at RT. See you next time, and remember, crosstalk rules. I love it.